We're going to get started. Welcome everyone to this session on Beyond Health and Safety, Addressing Worker Wellbeing. My name's Louise and I'm the moderator for today's session. Our session today is focused on the SMETA Health and Safety pillar and exploring the linkages between occupational health and safety and the concept of worker wellbeing. Before we start and introduce the concept further and I introduce the speakers for today, I just wanted to encourage you to take part in one of our live polls so that we can get a sense of the level of knowledge of this issue and the level of engagement on this issue in the room. So hopefully you'll have your apps or your laptops available to take part in the poll. This is the question that we would like you to answer. Is your organisation currently working on the issue of worker wellbeing? And there are 4 responses. Yes, at our own sites. Yes, with our supply chain, the assumption there being that you're working both sites, your own sites and in the supply chain. No, not at present. And no, we don't know what worker wellbeing is, all of which are completely valid responses. So if you could vote now. Do I need to press the next slide? I don't know what happens at this stage, sorry. Do I need to press the next one for the results? Oh, they're there, sorry, they weren't there. They're not there on the screen in front of me. I'm so sorry. Okay, great, okay. Well, that's really useful. And hopefully, I'm glad that there are lots of yeses in those top 2 boxes, because then when we open to the floor later on, hopefully we can hear lots from you about what you're doing in this area and hear from your experience. So in terms of when we talked as a panel about what our aims were from today's session, we had 4 of them. First of all, we wanted to raise awareness of the concept of worker wellbeing and explore what that meant a little bit more. We want, and I will encourage the speakers again, we've talked about this, to provide some really practical examples of what work in this area looks like in the food and non-food sector. We want to explore to an extent how worker wellbeing links to the concepts of worker empowerment and how a rights-based approach can be used within this area. And then finally, as I said just now, we want to hear from the room about your experience and the work that you're doing in this area. I know the speakers are likely to define worker wellbeing themselves as we go through. Just for the benefit of the percent that was up there who didn't know what the concept was, there are a couple of definitions that I was going to share today, one of which comes from the ILO, who talk about worker wellbeing relating to all aspects of working life, including quality and safety of physical environment, how workers feel about their work and their working environment, the climate at work and work organisation. And they talk about how worker wellbeing is intended to complement occupational health and safety, and that worker wellbeing is something that is important for making workers feel safe, healthy and engaged, and it is key to organisations' long-term effectiveness. The other definition, which I think is very helpful, is one that comes from Levi Strauss. If you go onto their website, you can see their approach, and to a lot of the work in this area is very much focused on the concept of worker wellbeing. And they talk about the term as encompassing financial wellbeing, health and family wellbeing, and equality and acceptance. And what I found interesting from their definitions was that gender and the issues of women's wellbeing was very much at the heart of their approach, which I think gender, one of the speakers yesterday mentioned, is something that we haven't talked a great deal about at the conference today, so that was quite useful. As I said, I know the speakers will expand on these concepts and definitions as they talk. They're also going to talk about how the concept of well-being fits in with the theme of the conference of going beyond compliance and taking a leadership role. So at this stage, I'd like to introduce you to our 3 speakers for today. Our first speaker is Dr. Prentice, who is a senior lecturer in anthropology at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. Rebecca is going to be talking about worker wellbeing from the perspective of workplace accidents and injuries, based on research conducted with the CNA Foundation, which is published today. So you're getting a first sight of that. Entitled Workers' Rights to Compensation After Garment Factory Disasters, Making Rights a Reality. Our second speaker is Mark Robertson, who is Senior Vice President of Communications and Stakeholder Engagement with the ICTI Toy Programme. Mark is going to present on their findings on worker wellbeing from China, where they've been piloting family-friendly spaces for migrant parents, running training workshops to support domestic migrant workers and left-behind children in China. And our final speaker, is Henrietta Lake from Lake Advisory, who many of you will know from her current work with Sainsburys, who is going to talk about her experience of best practice examples of worker wellbeing initiatives in the food and non-food sector. Each of our speakers will present for 5 to 7 minutes, after the final speaker, we'll take questions and comments. Please do submit questions as we go through online, or be ready to ask them at the end of Henrietta's presentation. And at this stage, I will hand over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to Louise and Virginie for organizing this session. It's a pleasure to be here and to be talking about the well-being of workers in global supply chains. And my talk comes at this issue by focusing on the most extreme violation of workers' well-being, which is death and injury in the workplace. And it looks at practical examples of what can be done to restore the well-being of survivors of factory disasters. And in so doing, I want not only to provide some guidelines and a call to action, but also to expand our understanding of workers' well-being to take on board a labor rights perspective. So as Louise mentioned, today marks the publication of a report that I've written with the support of the C&A Foundation, who commissioned the report, called Workers' Right to Compensation After Garment Factory Disasters, Making Rights a Reality. And the purpose of this report is to recognize that many garment-producing countries, and I'm sure this is the same for many other industries as well, do not have robust systems of workers' compensation. Therefore, an industrial accident that causes harm can have profoundly negative consequences for individuals and families, with the loss of income and the cost of medical care, pushing families deeper into vulnerability and poverty. As I'm sure you all know, the 2013 collapse of the Rana Plaza garment factory building in Bangladesh, which killed more than 1,000 people and injured hundreds more, led to a number of different initiatives to improve factory safety and to raise labor standards in Bangladesh. But what is less well known is that the collapse also galvanized innovative new approaches to workers' compensation. Within 3 years of the Rana Plaza collapse, injured workers and surviving family members were paid $30 million in compensation, mostly by global apparel brands and retailers through a collaborative, voluntary agreement brokered by the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And this new approach has since become a model used in compensating survivors of 2 other factory disasters that actually predated the Rana Plaza collapse, namely the 2012 fires in Bangladesh's Tazreen Fashions factory that killed at least 112 people, and the 2012 fire in Pakistan's Ali Enterprises, in which at least 255 people died. So the purpose of this report is to analyze, compare, draw lessons from these 3 post-Rana Plaza compensation schemes, to draw out their guiding principles, their challenges, the lessons learned, and to make recommendations for industry, government, and civil society. And the key recommendations of this report really fall into 2 categories. First is recognizing the profound need for national employment injury insurance schemes in garment-producing countries. And as I said, this is true, I'm sure, for other industries as well. And then second are the recommendations for how to respond to factory disasters that occur in the absence of such compensation schemes. So on this first recommendation, it really calls for a recognition of workers' right to compensation. This is a fundamental labor right, frequently not met by local employers and governments, which is why multinational companies are asked to step into the breach and pay compensation for harms done in their supplier factories, even when there may be no legal imperative for doing so. Global apparel companies can help this effort by lobbying the governments of countries from which they source, by insisting on the use of private injury insurance if there is no public scheme, even if it raises production costs. Despite the successes of the compensation schemes documented in my report, the Rana Plaza, Tazreen Fashions, and Ali Enterprises compensation, these types of voluntary arrangements created in the wake of a large-scale disaster present inherent challenges that are very, very difficult to overcome. And what's more, they only address the harms done to workers in high-profile disasters and leave out the many workers injured or killed beyond the glare of the media, and really require a functional workers' compensation system to already be in place. The second set of recommendations that I mentioned pertain to how to respond to a factory disaster that causes injury or loss of life, where there is no workers' compensation scheme that meets international standards of workers' rights. There are more details on this in my report, which is widely available from the CNA Foundation website, the University of Sussex website. I have copies with me here today as well. But just to draw together some of the key characteristics of successful compensation schemes created in response to factory disasters. First, they are multi-stakeholder in the truest sense, bringing together apparel companies, trade unions, NGOs, local employers, and the government to create a systematic and single approach to compensation. Second, these compensation schemes are rights-based. Compensation awards are calculated in line with the ILO's Employment Injury Benefits Convention, Convention 121, which codifies payments for lost wages and the costs of medical care in cases of workplace accidents. So compensation is paid as a right, not as a form of charity. Third is their fundamentally voluntary nature, which is something of a paradox. These compensation agreements were not imposed by the courts. Even though they are rights-based in their formulation, they do rely on voluntary commitment of stakeholders coming together to create and fund a compensation agreement. And I'd be happy in the questions to talk more about what that looks like and some of the challenges there. So within this panel, focusing on going beyond health and safety, my plea really is to look beyond securing the physical safety of the places in which people work, as important and vital as that is, to consider more broadly well-being as connected to a whole range of workers' rights, including their right to remedy. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and firstly thanks to Sedex for inviting me along today to share our experiences of the worker wellbeing programs that we've been working on. So I'm Mark Robertson. I work for the Ethical Toy Program. If you don't know us, we're the ethical supply chain program for the toy, entertainment and gaming industry. Our focus really is on protecting the rights and wellbeing of toy factory workers. And we certify around about 1,200 factories, mainly in China, but increasingly in other countries, and around about 1,000 brands and retailers sourced from toy factories in our program. So today, really, I'm going to focus on the worker wellbeing the programs that we've been delivering in China. And really, over the last few years, we've spent quite a lot of time initially really informally speaking to workers, speaking to factories, and working with local partners in China, really to understand what some of the kind of issues were beyond social compliance, the usual social compliance concerns that were impacting on toy factory workers' well-being in China. And actually one of the biggest challenges that we came across pretty quickly really was the issue of left behind children. And really this issue stems from the isolation which millions of factory workers face when they migrate domestically within China to find work elsewhere. So essentially this is about workers moving from what might be small rural communities in China to often to the large cities in the industrial south. There's around about 247 million migrant workers in China. A lot of those are parents, but the whole issue around left behind children is that for many of them, they're unable to bring their children with them when they move for work. And the result of that is that within China right now, there are millions of left behind children. So actually figures suggest there could be as many as 61 million left behind children in the country, which is something like 1 in 5 children in China and almost as many people as living in the UK. So obviously this is an issue that impacts on those children, certainly. It means that the children that are left behind are often poorly looked after by grandparents who might not have the physical ability or financial needs to look after them. There's numerous studies to show that these children are vulnerable to psychological and developmental issues. They suffer higher rates of depression. They're very vulnerable to accidents, even trafficking as well in certain areas. And they're very vulnerable during school holidays when they're often left unsupervised. So an issue certainly for children, but an issue we found obviously for workers. So all of that means that workers are living away from their children are often feeling very isolated. They may be suffering from depression. They're often very anxious about their children, constantly worrying about them, and they often feel very, very guilty. So as we looked at this problem in more detail at factories in our program, we found that 84% of workers reported feelings of guilt around the separation they felt. 44% said they didn't really know how to communicate with their children who were living remotely. And one of the key issues with the problem is that it's not just the separation, but it's the frequency of visits. So because many of these workers live maybe thousands of miles away from their children, they may see them just once a year. So it's a huge well-being issue that really, really impacts workers' happiness and satisfaction in the workplace. But the more we've looked at it, we've also found that it's got business impacts too. So it's not just working on, we're not just finding that workers are obviously unhappy in the workplace relating to the issue of left behind children, but it's having knock-on effects within the workplace as well. When workers are anxious, they're often distracted in the workplace through constant worry. There's often, we found a lack of commitment to their job. 31% of workers that we interviewed through surveys we've done at factories have said that they left a job at least once to have to go back to look after their children. So real retention challenges in factories. And actually, we do, the more that we've kind of interviewed workers, we found that workers who perceive their job as being negative on their family relationships, it really leads to them leaving the factory or looking for a better employer, because recruitment and the challenges that factories face in China around finding workers is an increasing challenge that means factories are now having to start to compete for the workforce. So that's a real business challenge. So that's the challenge. And starting in 2016, we started a worker wellbeing program to support migrant workers with left behind children in the country. Essentially, this falls into two parts. The first part is something called family-friendly spaces. So these are spaces that we create within factories, which are safe spaces for children to spend time away from the production floor. But the idea is that they basically reunite the workers with their children. So children come to spend time with their parents in the factory space, in a safe, well-catered for space during the summer months. And it's really having quite a profound impact on worker wellbeing and the children who are participating. So we're finding by providing opportunities for children to spend time with their parents in safe, secure environments, so they learn and play whilst their parents work. It's really, really improving the levels of worker well-being. The levels of worry amongst parents who are participating have really, really reduced. Parents report obviously stronger bonds with their children. They generally report being more happier and relaxed in the workplace. And we've done quite a lot of work to really kind of look at this in terms of measuring the impact more specifically amongst the workforce. So we find that, for example, 46% of participating workers report an increase in employee satisfaction, 146 increases in levels of trust between employees and management. We've also found that workers said that they have a tendency to make a more longer-term commitment to the factory. And we're also finding that the factory's reputation is really increasing, and the idea that as factories are participating in these programs, they're really becoming an employer of choice within the local community. The second part of that, of our wellbeing program, is what we call migrant parents training. So these are training sessions which really focus on helping parents who've left behind children build better bonds with their children. And essentially they focus the three core components to these training sessions. The first part really is about almost a kind of well-being session to help workers own the anxiety they feel and talk about it. So understand the anxiety and help them manage that in the workplace, almost like a counselling session. The second part of it is focused more on helping equip workers with better skills to help them remote parent more effectively. So that's focusing on issues like how to help workers have better conversations with their children on the phone, better questions to ask, how to be more effective parents remotely. And then the third part really is all around how to manage the separation more effectively. And part of this is how to manage kind of when saying goodbye to your children, when you visited them, and really how to support them at those difficult times when parents, when children might be particularly vulnerable. So again, we've measured the impacts of these, and they're really, really positive, not just for the workers involved, who again report similar benefits, but again for factories. In terms of the scale and scope of this, we've so far run the family-friendly spaces at a total of 12 factories at the pilot stage in China. The migrant parents training sessions that we've done have reached something like 3,000 workers, and this year we're looking to scale up to 10,000 workers reach through the training sessions. So I think that might be my time up, but obviously I'm available to answer more questions on that work.
Give me a cup of tea, I'm a bit croaky. Hello everybody, I am Henry Lake. Can I start with a story? Will you indulge me? I didn't sleep well last night. I had an argument with my husband about money. He doesn't like me working out of the home, but he seems to like the money I bring home. He takes that money every month. He's wanted to buy certain things. He's gone and borrowed more money from a moneylender. I don't think that's a good idea, but I can't tell him that. I don't often feel safe around him. I was really worried about my younger child last night as well. He was coughing terribly. And I just don't know what to do about it. He can hardly breathe, but I don't think I can afford the medicine for him. It took me 2 hours to get to work this morning. Sitting in the traffic, the bus was late. I arrived. I tried to dodge the security guard that I know likes to feel up the women as they, for security when we leave the premises. There are some that are okay, and there are some where I feel really humiliated and violated. When I got to my workstation and I was late, and my boss shouted at me. I know that's not, on the one hand, I know it's not personal. He hasn't been given the training and the support to know how to manage our team. Nobody really wants the job to be a line supervisor. They don't get paid much more. They just get much more stress. He was just one of us and got promoted, and I know that he's dealing with a huge amount of pressure, and I know that his boss shouts at him. We've got an order. Materials were late, but we've still got to make the order on time. We've got to do double the amount of work in the amount of time the shipment still needs to go. My machine has just broke down. The mechanic's going to take time to get there. I don't know how to fix it. I'm feeling really under pressure by my team members, because I don't want to let them down. I'm exhausted. I did overtime every single day last week. And I'm trying to concentrate. I need to go to the loo, but the loos are disgusting, and it'll make my it'll make me even later and we'll miss our targets. I'm stressed, I don't feel well, I'm worried about what my husband's going to say when I get home from work and having another argument with him. I'm really worried about my child. That's the end of my story. So, which bits of that story do you think are about me? And which bits do you think might come from the many millions of women working in manufacturing in our supply chains? And the point is, it doesn't really matter. Some of those parts of that story aren't actually mine. That might be a minor or major. Minor, I'll say. That's good. And the point, it doesn't really matter. And if you recognize any part of that story yourself, if you're exhausted, not feeling well, worried about your children, you're far away from your children. Can you imagine only seeing your child once a year? Sorry, I'm sounding very croaky. It's just the end of a cold. But if you recognize any of that, whether in your own experience or in the experience that you have through your job, through your work, when you go to factories or on farms, then you already get worker well-being. So I'd like to make 3 points that on some level this is not complicated. This is about universal human needs and aspirations and rights. It also links to one of the themes of this conference. I could say, what did Clinton, it's the economy stupid. It's the system stupid. This is about systems thinking and about seeing all of the connections. And the third point I'd like to make is that you can actually have much more influence than you think, because the work and personal spheres are not distinct. We all take work home to a certain degree, lesser or more, hopefully less, but we also bring home into the workplace. And so how you feel, and Louise has already talked about the definitions of engagement, but of course, if you just think about your own experience, of course, how well you feel, how exhausted you are, how your supervisor talks to you, the whole setup at work and at home is going to influence your performance, which is why there is a business case to all of that, not just rights, and it's a nice thing to do and morally the right thing. So, why does this matter to us? It matters to us because if we think about well-being and engagement, it doesn't matter whether we can argue about definitions, whether well-being is a part of engagement or whether engagement is a part of well-being. They're really all about the connectedness. And the thing is, up until now, a lot of people have done programs, but they're quite piecemeal. And there might be a financial literacy program or a childcare program, which is absolutely admirable. But these programs are not going to make the difference, that sustained systems change, if we don't think about the whole ecosystem and try and address that at the start. We have to think about systems change. We have to think about the multiple dimensions and the link with outside and inside. And this affects everything from good access to finance to a safe, clean, healthy working environment, having insurance, etc. It's about that enabling environment. And there are lots of other disciplines, lots of academics, from occupational health and safety, but also all sorts of disciplines, economics, management, business, that have come to the same conclusions, that how a worker feels, how engaged they feel, how well they feel, impacts their performance. And it's all about control, demands, and support. The control you have over your environment, how many demands are put on you, and that enabling environment, that support that you get from your workplace. So there's lots of evidence that this works from McKinsey, Gallup, Willis Towers Watson. So the accountants, the strategic consultants have all shown that there are the companies that manage to provide that enabling environment for their workers and think about all the connections in their lives, because we are, it's a 24/7 thing. If you're brave enough to think about those connections and make those connections, you're going to have much greater returns, higher operating profit, better retention, etc. So I know Louise set this up, that I would give you examples, and I do have some examples, but I have to say that it's quite early days. I'm working with a number of companies that are beginning to think about this. And the first step is just to sort of recognize that we need to think bigger and be more ambitious and think about the systems and think about all the connections. And so if you're doing a worker survey, we've all been doing worker surveys for ages about sort of satisfaction. Are you satisfied here? Would you recommend this job to somebody else? But really we need to start going beyond that and asking questions about that whole sphere, all of the different elements of worker well-being, so that we can map, not only can we track our programs and see how it's influencing engagement and well-being, which we know has positive outcomes for workers and the business, but also so that we can see areas of opportunity to go after where there are gaps in provision, where a supervisor needs extra training, or actually, you need new machines, or whether it's workers are so indebted and maybe there's an opportunity there to provide finance at good rates. So there are a lot of brands that I know and work with, Gap, Nike, Levi's, Adidas, that are starting to run surveys through some partners who are here today, so please do go and speak to some of these people, that are starting to ask the questions and to make the connections. With Nike, we did some quite interesting work. We ran, the lean management sort of Kaizens, and we did well-being Kaizen. So we got workers to think about, to start solving, not just focusing on something in the production process, but actually what were some of their sort of larger needs. And it could have been about transportation or how supervisors treat them. And they spent days together in a room brainstorming and coming up with a plan on what to do about it. And there were some quite impressive presentations. We've also done some work, brought in social entrepreneurs to come and provide products and services to these workers to meet their needs, because the brands and the companies can't do all this themselves. It's about being connected and working with other partners. And one of the other things that's really fascinating as well is about stress. We all know we're so influenced by stress in our work and at home. And we've now got, just been talking to Sam earlier, and I was lucky enough to work with her on an earlier project. Sam's just come back from Mauritius, where she's been training workers, sort of the management level, line leaders and also workers, on stress management, on breathing techniques, and how to manage, because we've all got these stresses. And it's the people who need more support that we don't, we all have programs at work, wellness programs, health insurance, but it's the very people that need that more than us, really, that don't get it. And it makes a difference. And you can tangibly see that when you start to address these very human needs, it makes a huge difference to operations, profits, retention, and workers' reported satisfaction and wellness. So thank you. I do have some other examples which we can talk about if we need to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our speakers. A question from me, if I may indulge that, just to start us off. I'm interested from all of your views in terms of looking at worker well-being. How do we, for me, when I was first asked to moderate this session, there's something about the terminology, and I think, to be honest, I think the terminology worker well-being is something that probably originated in the States, I'm guessing, which is maybe why it's slightly less familiar here. My immediate thought was back to the old days, in a way, within the area of ethical trade and human rights, where a lot of us used to talk about worker welfare, a term that felt slightly kind of patronising and paternalistic. So thinking about worker well-being, how do we implement programmes in this area that really empower workers and come from that perspective of linking into a rights-based approach? I don't know, Henry, do you want to start us off on that?
Yes, so it's quite interesting. Is this mic on? Oh,
yeah.
Now it is, yes. Well, it's good that it was off because you didn't want to hear my snuffling and coughing. Yes, it was quite interesting. When I was introducing some of these programmes and people, some of the management level at the brands, but also certainly at the factory level, would say, okay, I sort of get what you're saying, but really all we can do at the factory is just focus on the workplace, and we can't hope to solve any of these problems about gender imbalance in the community, rights, empowerment, traffic problems. But you know what? You actually can. So if in the workplace we are teaching workers that they have the right to share their voice and opinion, we're teaching them in the work context to stand up, share, engage, have an opinion, and that opinion gets recognised, that cannot but have an impact outside in the community. So I think, and I've yet to see that measured, so I'll put but talking to workers and through anecdotal evidence, and I think that's one of the opportunities where we really ought to show those links. So if in the workplace, if we get workers sharing ideas about production issues or non-production issues, and they can see, and then also their value-added contribution is recognised, that's going to give them a feeling of empowerment that their voices should be recognised. And I've seen, certainly in the work that I've done in factories, the level of confidence inside the workplace is very, very apparent.
Great, thank you. Mark?
Sure. So I think for us, it kind of starts really with creating an environment where workers feel that it's okay to express their concerns or issues. So within, not just in toy manufacturing, but I think within manufacturing in China more generally, there's some good work around worker voice, which is, I think a lot of us are now working on, but there's still a real challenge, I think, to create spaces or cultures in factories where workers feel that they're able or encouraged to express what's important to them beyond, if you like, life and limb issues sometimes. So I think firstly, focusing on that, and how do you get there? Well, I think the work that we've done has really focused on creating the right kind of culture in factories. So a lot of intensive work directly with factory management, right down to line managers, to help them understand the benefits of worker well-being and make sure that factories aren't afraid to engage with these issues as well, because I think sometimes the first fear perhaps from a factory perspective might be, am I just going to unleash an onslaught of concerns? And I think they've learned that's not the case. And so I think certainly creating that culture is really important. You've also obviously then got to listen to workers and make sure that you respond to the issues that they raise. I mean, it's an obvious point, but it's a really important one. And in doing that, you might get to quite a different place. So for us, our focus in China, as I outlined, has very much been on left behind children. We work on other issues as well, and in India, for example, we're doing work on women's empowerment. But what we're really trying to do with our program is find out what the kind of key issues are and then work on them on quite a specific level. And I guess the final part to the piece would be around actually involving workers in the design of programs. So making sure that these aren't things that are done to them. So again, in the case of our left, they feel that they're participating. So with the Left Behind Children program, as we were designing the spaces in factories for children to participate in, making sure that they were fun environments, educational environments. We made sure that workers were very much part of the planning and design of those. So that's quite a specific example, but I think making sure that you engage workers is really, really important as well.
Thank you. Okay. Because I'm working in a context where there's been such extreme violations of workers' rights to life, injuries in factory fires and collapses. I think this idea of well-being is one that goes along with the idea of workers' health and safety as a basic right. So there's been tremendous efforts in Bangladesh to improve the physical safety of buildings. So the Accord on Fire and Safety in Bangladesh, which is a pact between organized labor and multinational companies to agree to factory standards and to remediation plans, really are making a difference to the safety of factories in the garment sector in Bangladesh. And so then the question of well-being comes in when we think about, well, is all we're concerned about this kind of basic level of factories not falling down on people or burning up around them? No, we're interested in kind of far more aspects of workers' experiences. And so there's one piece of well-being which is trying to say, okay, well, what's beyond safety? What are, and some of the things that Henry was talking about around kind of how workers feel about work. But I think it's important to kind of take a step back and think about the conditions that have brought about these deaths and injuries, which is constantly focusing on technical solutions when sometimes we need to look more in depth at the politics of labor and look at how production is organized. Do workers have a right to organize? And we're talking a lot about workers having a right to engage their voice, and to speak out, but do they have a right to organize? And we're seeing in some of these contexts where workers are, they're actively being denied those rights. And And so I'm kind of trying to bring that into the equation as well. And as much as well-being is something I think we'd all agree is important and we want to promote, I think we need to not be naive to the fact that not safeguarding well-being can also be very profitable, and that it's not just a business case, let's secure workers' well-being, because these are supplier factories. Many companies would find it's perfectly acceptable not to do that. So we can't sort of pretend that all all roads lead to well-being, and this is the only business case that can be made.
Great, thank you. Sorry, just a question for Sedex. Do we have any roving mics if people in the floor want to make... I'm conscious that at the beginning, when we did the live poll, there were a number of people in the room who said that they were working on this, both in their own operations and also in their supply chains. We have some great questions that I want to come to, but I wanted to offer people the opportunity. This is a positive, good news story, so not something to be afraid of sharing, I don't think. But it would be fab to hear some examples from the floor if there is anyone that feels brave enough to share. Please. Unfortunately, I don't have a spotlight to be able to link to the live poll, and no, we have a hand over there. If you could just keep it really brief, but it'd be great to know what you're doing and give us a bit of a flavour.
Although I was very interested in what Henry said a minute ago. So I'm Tara from BSR. I used to be a part of Sedex, so it's really nice to come back. We are working with a group of apparel brands who are looking at collaborating, or not looking at, who are actively collaborating on aligning their engagement efforts, their worker engagement efforts. And so very curious to hear that there's another initiative going on potentially among other groups, and it sounds like we should try to align those efforts.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing, just to give people...
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to be really brief,
no,
so I was
sorry.
following the brief. Too
Sorry,
brief,
that's my
clearly.
fault.
No, but basically recognizing that most of these many apparel brands, and this is driven largely by U.S. brands, but it's not exclusive, actually have active worker engagement, worker voice programs within their factories, and they've recognized that they don't want to continue creating duplicative efforts. And so the idea is actually to work on harmonizing. But a lot of what I'm hearing on this panel, the questions around the definition between engagement and well-being are things that are being discussed. And another key part of the initiative is actually looking at how do we drive this ownership at the factory level. So it's not just brands that are going around with their own programs, it's actually the factories and the suppliers that are taking ownership of this. So there's a lot of pieces to it, but it's basically part of connecting the dots in the way that Henry outlined, and it's very encouraging. And it wasn't started by us; it was started by the brands, Gap, Nike, etc., who are part of it.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other examples? Got a lady in the scarf?
Hi, I'm Elena. I'm from Workplace Options. We're actually one of the service providers that BSR's group is looking, or that some of the brands that are in that group are looking at, and we've worked with Henry as well. What we have seen to be most successful is it's really hard for the factories to see the value in it immediately, but once they do it, we've seen every single factory who has been given the opportunity by their brand, has been paid for it, a pilot paid for it by their brand, end up investing in it in themselves. And that's because we can show value in it. So, for example, we reduce turnover by 33%. That's huge for factories in China. Or we're able to show that there's less absenteeism. Or workers are more engaged and they're less stressed, and so they're more likely to use services that maybe the factory is already providing. And so I think when you say what's the cost model, in my opinion, the factories have to pay for it in the end, but it's about making the business case to them. I think it's a really important and valid business case that will make them believe in it, and it saves them money.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I'll just stand by you. So my name's Sam Thorpe, and thank you very much to Henry for mentioning the work we do. Many of you probably know Vic Thorpe from Just Solutions. I'm his wife, Sam Thorpe, and it's as a result of the work that he does with freedom of association and worker voice and engagement that we were able to begin the work that we do with stress management. So to kind of address some of the questions from my experience, and my background is in stress and trauma and post-traumatic intervention, so I'd quite like to have a chat about that. We have to be able to identify what triggers different people at different levels. If you want to engage more people and you want to get the factories and the manufacturers and the brands engaged, you have to recognize what is stress to that person. Because what triggers us is an animalistic response. And if we can't deal with what is an animalistic response to us, which is very individual, then we aren't going to be able to develop broader programs. So the way that we deliver our work is that we go in at the different levels and we meet the needs of those different levels. So in Mauritius, we trained 8,500 workers over 3 weeks across management, middle management, and the workers, across 3 factories and 4 different language and cultural background groups. And we were able to bring that whole factory structure together for 1 minute in the morning to do a very simple breathing technique. But it's not the technique that's the key, it's the education and the awareness of the impact of stress and trauma. So right from the management down to the worker, they understand why the physical, mental, emotional impacts of why they experience what they do, what is individual to them, and therefore we develop our humanity again. We get our compassion back for other people. The workers had compassion for the supervisors understood the workers better, and the management. So there is a new dialogue and a new strength of dialogue that is developed.
Great, thank you. Can I just ask if there are any, in the interest of balance, and because it's the sector I work most in, are there any food examples? Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda from CP Foods. Probably not as formal as a lot of the ones I'm hearing now, but we had our annual employee briefing about a month ago, and within the 2-hour lunch window, we put a health and well-being section in the day for all of the staff. And in our worker groups at the so we had factory and salaried and office staff in that forum. Normally we would get very little engagement from our staff employees on some of those forums, and lots of comments from office staff, clearly have got lots of views and a voice. But in this health and well-being section, we had massages, we had a happy yoga session, we had a little exercise bike turning into fruit smoothies. It was really interactive. Now, we expected the salaried staff to have a go at it and really get a lot out of it, but the engagement from all of the staff in the factory that don't normally have a voice was amazing. So we will continue those sort of initiatives and try and get more engagement on the other more formal methods, but it was a really informal way of getting a lot of health and wellbeing engagement from the team.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you to everyone for sharing those examples. I'm just going to come to some of the questions. We can't cover them all, but the first one, which is a fairly punchy one, about consumer awareness of these particular issues. I mean, this was raised in the last session around modern slavery, and it feels a little bit like the unspoken question of a lot of what we're talking about here is how do we actually get consumers to understand the issues that lie behind the products that they buy. You don't all have to answer because I think it's a fairly difficult question, but any thoughts that people would like to share?
Yeah, sure. So obviously we work in the toy entertainment industry. It's a challenge. Our program's focus really is on working more with brands, retailers, factories. So we're not really a consumer facing organisation as such. That said, it's something that we're focusing on more and more and thinking about how we tackle it. I mean, in toys, there's often calls for the idea of having some kind of label or certification label to signify that a toy or similar product has been manufactured in an ethical manner, however you want to define that. But the challenge, of course, is how do you bundle all these issues together, and how do you make that kind of label meaningful? And I think that perhaps one of the challenges around it is making sure that the claims you make, of course, are robust, but as we were talking about worker well-being today, it's making sure that you fully represent the full scale of issues that you need to worry about when you're placing a stamp on a product like that. So it's something that we're starting to look at, and just through general awareness raising and really trying to firstly encourage consumers to think about these issues, but also to think about them more in the round, so not just the kind of day-to-day basic compliance issues, but to value some of the work that we're talking about today as well. But for us, it's an ongoing challenge, really.
Can I, sorry to slightly change the form, but Henry, I just wonder if I can ask you the second question, just so we can get through a few more.
Yes.
So someone has asked how these things are financed, and we had a suggestion from the floor, but from your experience, how are worker wellbeing programmes generally financed?
I think it generally starts off with the brand, and then going to a cost-sharing model, and then longer term, the supplier needs to pay for it. The employer or the company that is contracting the workers, that it can't be done at arm's length, but you usually, sometimes you need that intervention initially just to get factory managers to kind of understand what the benefits would be, and it takes time. And you were saying earlier as well, and it's certainly been in my experience, this is not, you don't walk in to a room, explain this, and suddenly go, oh yes, of course, great, we'll do it, we'll start tomorrow. This is months and years of explaining, piloting, getting them to see the benefits. So I think it's a slow process. And also we shouldn't forget, a lot of these companies themselves have actually also been doing good work and been thinking about this themselves, in country, but it tended to be quite sort of paternalistic and quite philanthropic. So they may have had a childcare centre, or they may have given, funds to the local community. And what we're trying to do is to get them to see, well, that's great, but you could actually divert some of those funds into some other programs that would have multiple benefits. And I just have to 2 cents on consumers. I'm not holding my breath. I don't think that is. I think we can carry on working on that, and I think the whole transparency agenda is really going to help. I'm not going to open that box up now, because there's so much that could be said. So I think that there is some hope, but I don't think that that's going to get us where we need to be soon.
Okay, thank you very much. We're short on time, but Rebecca, if I can ask you the question up there about protecting the funds of compensated families from those groups that were mentioned there.
Yeah, that's such a great question. One of the reasons why the main finding of the report is to call for national employment injury insurance schemes that meet the ILO's standard is that the standard for these kind of schemes is that if you are an injured worker, disabled worker as a result of a workplace incident, or the widow or dependent of someone who's been killed on the job, the best practice is that you should be paid a monthly pension. And the whole idea being that the money should be under the control of individuals, and that it should be paid as an ongoing income replacement. Because giving somebody a lump sum in a situation where there's vast power differentials across generational lines or gender lines can actually put people's lives in danger, and people's money can be taken, etc. So within these compensation schemes that I've been talking about, there have been some efforts to try and provide a pension, as they did in the Ali Enterprises example, so it's a monthly sum coming in. But in the Rana Plaza and Tazreen cases, because of difficulties of administrating this in Bangladesh, they had to pay out a lump sum. And with the Tazreen fashions compensation, what was done was encouraging recipients of the compensation to purchase Sanchaya Patra, which are these savings bonds which pay out periodic income. So this is a great question. It kind of points to why more kind of national and public-based systems really are better for survivors of these kind of disasters.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone for your questions, and thank you obviously to the panel. We've heard from speakers today. I hope that you've got a much clearer sense of the concept of worker wellbeing taking us beyond physical safety in the workplace, whether that be to injury insurance schemes or schemes around individual and family wellbeing. We wanted to finish the session with an active impact assessment, so get a sense of, obviously this is all anonymous, get a sense of whether this session has been useful for you. Do you feel better equipped now to work on wellbeing in your own organisation? Don't feel afraid to crush our hopes and dreams by saying no, if that's the answer to this question. But if you'd like to vote now, that would be great. Great. Okay, good. Well, that's positive feedback. Thank you very much, everyone, for that. I just want to finish by just giving you a quote from Stephen Hawking, who many of you may be aware passed away today, just to give you something to think about. He said, "Remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about what makes the universe exist. Be curious, and however difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. It matters that you don't just give up." So please take that away with you to lunch and think about what you can do in this area. Thank you very much.